The truth about women who live alone without a man. People think the worst thing that can happen to a woman is loneliness. They imagine empty rooms, silent dinners, cold sheets, long nights where the absence of another body feels like proof of some invisible failure. They believe a woman living alone must be incomplete somehow, unfinished, waiting for someone to arrive and make her whole. But they are wrong. The most dangerous part isn't the silence. It isn't the solitude. It isn't the empty side of the bed or the quiet echo of her footsteps through a darkened home. The real horror begins when a woman discovers she prefers it. Because the moment a woman learns how to live without male validation, without emotional dependency, without the constant low hum of needing to be chosen, something ancient inside her wakes up. And once that awakening begins, there is no going back. What most people call loneliness is often the first stage of psychological liberation. What society labels absence is often the beginning of presence. And what many men fear most is not a woman being abandoned, but a woman discovering she was never lacking anything to begin with. Stay with me because what happens next changes everything. Chase Hughes discovered something terrifying about human attachment. He understood that dependence is not always love. Sometimes it is simply psychological conditioning dressed in the language of devotion. And according to Jungian psychology, every person carries a shadow, the disowned parts of themselves buried beneath years of adaptation, suppression, and self-abandonment. For women who spent years defining themselves through relationships, through sacrifice, through emotional caretaking, this shadow often contains something shocking: power. Hughes called this phenomenon psychological compensation. The psyche always seeks equilibrium, and when one side of the self has been denied for too long, it does not disappear. It waits, quietly, patiently, gathering force beneath the surface like tectonic pressure beneath a sleeping city. Then one day the ground splits open. This is an antiodromia. Carl Jung described it as the eventual transformation of something into its opposite. Push softness too far and it becomes steel. Suppress anger too long and it returns as clarity. Abandon the self for years and eventually the self comes back to reclaim what was stolen. And this is what happens to many women who learn to live alone. Not because they wanted isolation, but because pain forced them inward. At first it felt unbearable. The silence was loud. The walls of the house seemed to breathe at night. Every room held ghosts of conversations unfinished, apologies never spoken, betrayals still hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. They replayed every sacrifice they made, every time they forgave too quickly, every time they swallowed anger to keep the peace, every time they made themselves smaller so someone else could feel larger. They became a sponge for pain, absorbing disappointment after disappointment until their emotional skin became waterlogged and heavy. They poured themselves into a bottomless well, hoping love would somehow echo back, but all they ever heard was silence. And still they stayed. They built bridges for people who only burned them. They offered warmth to hands that only knew how to take. They bent and bent and bent until their spirit became a rubber band stretched so tightly it trembled with invisible strain. Then one day, it snapped. Not with drama, not with shouting, not with tears, but with something far more chilling. A click, quiet, instant, irreversible, like a receiver going dead on the other end of a line, like the sound of a lock turning inside a sealed house, like a bridge collapsing in total silence while no one was looking. The moment itself is almost impossible to explain unless you've lived it. Nothing dramatic happens externally. She may still smile, still answer texts, still go to work, still move through the motions of ordinary life, but internally something ancient has shut down forever. The signal is gone. The emotional frequency that once tuned itself to everyone else's needs has gone dark, like a lighthouse extinguishing its beam after years of guiding ships that never thanked it. And this is where people misunderstand what comes next. They think she has become cold. They think she is bitter, wounded, closed off. But Hughes understood something terrifying about this moment. This is not emotional death. This is shadow integration. The part of her she was taught to fear begins to rise. The part that says no without guilt. The part that chooses solitude over chaos. The part that no longer apologizes for needing peace. For years, she projected her worth outward, believing love must be earned through usefulness, sacrifice, availability. This was projection, the mistaken belief that what she needed existed somewhere outside herself. But when the illusion shatters, the projection collapses like glass under pressure, and beneath it stands the abandoned self, waiting, patient as stone. This is individuation, the sacred psychological process of becoming whole. Not by adding something external, but by reclaiming what was buried. She doesn't become colder. She becomes complete. The part she feared would make her selfish becomes the part that saves her life. And slowly the fortress walls begin to rise, not as punishment, as protection. Brick by brick, boundary by boundary, she rebuilds herself into something untouchable. The house is finally secured. The doors lock cleanly now. The windows no longer stay open for intruders disguised as lovers. The emotional leash that once dragged behind her has been severed. And this is the moment manipulators begin to panic, because emotional control depends on access. It requires hooks, open wounds, unmet needs. It feeds on the desperate hope that maybe this time they'll change. But once a woman living alone has integrated her shadow, those hooks find nothing to catch. Guilt stops working. The old apologies sound hollow, like rehearsed lines spoken on an empty stage. Love bombing becomes transparent, desperate fireworks exploding against a sky that no longer notices. The manipulator feels it immediately. They sense the shift the way animals sense an approaching storm. Something has changed. Their words land differently now. Their carefully timed disappearances no longer create panic. Their sudden returns no longer create relief. It is like throwing stones into a well that has finally gone dry. No echo comes back, and this confuses them because they built their power on her emotional responsiveness, her need to repair, her instinct to explain, soothe, forgive, understand. But now she simply watches, calm, detached, silent, not because she is performing strength, because she no longer needs anything from them. And there is nothing more terrifying to a manipulator than irrelevance. This is the birth of psychological immunity. Hughes believed true sovereignty begins when external validation loses its authority over internal peace. This is radical acceptance, the understanding that not everyone will love you correctly, and that this no longer has the power to destroy you. It arrives like dawn after years underground. At first it feels unfamiliar, too quiet, too still. She waits for anxiety to return, for the old panic to knock on the door like an unwelcome guest. But it doesn't, because the nervous system has finally learned safety. The war is over, and what replaces it is extraordinary. Inner stillness. A calm so profound it feels supernatural. The kind of silence forged only in fire. Like emotional armor hammered into shape after surviving every impossible night. She no longer scans every text for hidden meaning. No longer wonders if silence means rejection. No longer rearranges her identity to fit someone else's expectations. The shattered illusion is gone, and through the broken glass, clarity enters like moonlight flooding a ruined cathedral. This is ego dissolution. The collapse of the false self built entirely around being needed, and in its place emerges sovereignty. She begins moving differently, speaking differently. Even her silence changes. It is no longer heavy with sadness. It becomes majestic, like locked gates protecting sacred ground, and eventually she reaches the final stage. Indifference. This word is often misunderstood. People mistake it for cruelty, for resentment, for revenge. It is none of these things. True indifference is transcendence. It is what happens when someone no longer occupies psychic space inside you, when their absence no longer feels like loss, when their opinion no longer bends your reality. She stops explaining herself, stops defending her choices, stops hoping they will finally understand what they destroyed, because understanding is no longer required for her peace. This is wisdom, the deepest kind, the kind carved slowly into the soul after surviving what should have broken it. She becomes unreachable, not because she is hiding, but because she has risen beyond the emotional altitude where manipulation can breathe. And this is the truth about women who live alone without a man. They are not waiting. They are not lacking. They are not secretly incomplete. What appears from the outside as solitude is often the final stage of psychological rebirth. Behind closed doors, something sacred is happening. A woman is remembering herself. The silence people pity has become her sanctuary. The emptiness they fear has become her freedom. The stillness they misunderstand has become her power. She was never being punished by solitude. She was being prepared by it. Every quiet night was another layer of illusion dissolving. Every lonely evening was another chain rusting through. Every moment alone was another piece of herself returning home. And when she is finally whole again, something hauntingly beautiful happens. She no longer seeks to be chosen, because she has already chosen herself. She no longer waits for rescue, because she has become her own refuge. She no longer fears being alone. She had simply been separated from herself. And now that separation is over, the silence you hear is not emptiness. It is the sound of a soul becoming whole. They were never losing her. She was finding herself.